The universe seems to be fine-tuning. If the value of this physical law would much change in either direction, then all we see and know could not exist. Physicists prefer the idea of the multiverse so that you wouldn't then have to invoke the big G. Some may say that the science and theology together reveal the reality. Some may say that only science makes sense. Theology is a myth, a woo. Today, our topic is making space and time for mind. In this series, we are delighted to have Emeritus Professor Bernard Carr of Mathematics and Astronomy at Queen's Mary College, University of London. He is co-author of the book Quantum Black Holes, and he is also editor of the Universe and Multiverse. He is ex-president of the Society of Psychical Research, and is also currently president of the Scientific and Medical Network. Professor Carr is going to do a presentation on his model of consciousness with us today. Welcome, Professor Carr.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be talking. I've never spoken to you before. In fact, I've never spoken to any such organization in this format before, so it's all quite exciting for me. Thanks to Ivy, I found out a little bit about you beforehand. I read your remit on the website. I'm not quite sure how my presentation is going to fit into that, but I'll be looking forward anyway to getting your reaction. And in fact, I'm hoping I will learn as much about you as you will learn about me. Now, I know you want me to talk about some of my ideas about how physics can be extended to accommodate mind by using higher dimensions. And I'll get onto that really later on in the second part of my talk. But I thought it would be more useful to start off by putting that work in a broader context of my interests in life. I should explain, as Ivy said, really, that professionally I'm a physicist, I'm a cosmologist, and I work on topics like the early universe, the dark matter problem, black holes, the multiverse, and a variety of things within respectable physics. I did my PhD with Stephen Hawking, which I guess means I'm quite respectable. However, what I'm really going to be talking about, my interests that go beyond respectable physics, in the sense that they are not mainstream physics. But nevertheless, they're my personal interest and my personal passion. Because they go beyond conventional physics. And it might be useful to sort of put this in a historical context. My interests all started when I was at school, about 15 years of age. I was at a boarding school, and I misbehaved on one occasion. I won't go into details, and as a punishment I was confined to my room except for lessons, and this meant I had nothing to do except read. And I read 3 books. The first book was a book about Einstein's theory of relativity. It's called The ABC of Relativity, and that got me interested in physics and space and time. The second book was called An Experiment with Time by someone called J.W. Dunn, and that was about he had precognitive dreams and some theory of time to explain them. And that got me interested in premonition and psychical research. The third book, it was called The Third Eye by Lobsang Rampo, who was allegedly the spirit of a Tibetan Lama who'd taken over the body of a Cornish fisherman. And I don't really know if people believe that now, but anyway, I was fascinated in the book because he was talking about his interest in, about his experiences as a Tibetan Buddhist, as a Tibetan Lama, and his various psychic experiences. And those 3 books really were the start of my 3 passions in life: my interest in physics, my interest in psychical research, and my interest in religion. I mean, in that case it was Buddhism, but more generally religion. And so, ironically, those are the 3 interests I've had throughout my life. When I went to Cambridge University as a student, I immediately joined the Cambridge University Astronomy Society, the University Buddhist Society, and the University Society for Psychical Research. So I carried on my interests, but then I had to decide, when I did a PhD, I had to decide, well, what career will I pursue? And I decided I would study physics. I did a PhD in cosmology with Stephen Hawking. But I still maintained my interest in psychical research and in spiritual matters. And indeed, in my professional life, most of my effort has obviously gone into my professional career as a researcher in cosmology and as a teacher, and all the normal chores that a university academic has. But I also kept up my interest in my spare time, if you like, in those other areas. But the key point was that although I was passionate about physics, I also felt there was a connection between physics and these other areas of psychical research and spiritual experience. And it became my ambition, even as a teenager, to expand physics to accommodate psychical and spiritual experience. And really, that's been my passion in life. As it happened, though, I mean, I ended up spending most of my life on straightforward physics. But recently I retired, and because I recently retired, I can now spend more time on these other directions. But it's quite an amusing story, though, because it shows how everything I've done in life is all because I misbehaved as a schoolboy. So I'm not trying to encourage misbehavior, but it's funny how things turn out sometimes. Well, but let me now talk more generally about what I'm trying to do. I'm interested in what we might call the three worlds. There's the world of matter, and the world of mind, and the world of spirit. Now, you can interpret those in all sorts of different ways. For example, in terms of academic disciplines, matter is, if you like, it's the domain of science. Mind is the domain of the humanities and the arts, and spirit is the domain of religious studies. But that's from an academic perspective. In our everyday life, all of us live in these three worlds, and obviously depending on our interests, we will spend more time in one world than another. So, for example, if you're a dedicated scientist, you spend most of your time in science. You don't spend so much time in the worlds of art and the world of spirituality. But if you're a mystic, you're going to spend most of your time in the world of spirit, and you won't spend so much of your time in the world of matter. So all of us individually focused to different extents on these three worlds. But the point is, humanity as a whole has to be involved in all three of these worlds. And I think it's very important for some of us to try and link up these three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit. And the point is that these three worlds are not entirely separate. These three worlds are actually linked. So, for example, the link between matter and mind, I mean, there are many links between matter and mind. But for me, I'm particularly interested in the link of psychical research. Now, I don't know whether everybody here knows what I mean by psychical research. Maybe Ivy, you can advise me. Is this something people have heard about and talked about, or do I need to explain what I mean by psychical research? Let me just say, psychical research means those phenomena such as telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, clairvoyance, knowing what's going on but not through the brain, precognition, sometimes even mind affecting matter, making objects move. They're all those phenomena which conventional scientists tend to be rather skeptical of. But what's fascinating about these phenomena is that they involve an interaction between consciousness and the physical world. and it's an interaction which isn't just explained through the brain. I mean, obviously our consciousness interacts with the physical world through the brain, but psychic phenomena seem to involve a direct interaction between consciousness and the physical world. But you see, that provides a bridge between mind and matter, because the mind is directly affecting the material world. And because I'm a physicist, because I want to explain the physical world, if the mind is affecting the physical world, physics has to be expanded to accommodate that interaction. So that's the link between matter and mind. Now, there's also a link between mind and spirit. This is what I call the domain of transpersonal psychology. When we talk about psychic phenomena, we might mean things like telepathy or precognition, but there are other phenomena which also are spiritual. For example, you might have an out-of-body experience where you seem to leave your body. You might die and have a near-death experience, but later get revived. Or you simply might have a mystical experience. And there are many types of mystical experiences, but the point is they have a spiritual component. But the point is there isn't a clear contrast between psychic experiences in the world of mind and and mystical experiences in the world of spirit. There's a sort of continuum of these experiences. And so that's why, if you like, there's a bridge between mind and spirit. Now, there's also a link between matter and spirit, which I won't go into, but this is the whole domain of the relationship between science and religion. And
someone is asking, is this parapsychology? Is it related to it?
Yes, good. Thank you for asking that. Parapsychology is essentially equivalent to psychical research. Psychical research is the older term. It goes back to the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in England in 1882. Parapsychology is the field as a branch of psychology which investigates these phenomena in the laboratory. So this started with J.B. Rhine in the 1930s. But people sometimes use the word parapsychology and psychical research interchangeably. However, parapsychology is normally regarded as more laboratory-based, the sort of psychical research done in universities, whereas the psychical research which other people are interested in are more involving spontaneous experiences, like seeing ghosts or having out-of-body experiences or something like that. So the point is, I'm trying to explain why there are these three worlds and they're all linked together. That I was going to say the link between matter and spirit, for me, as a cosmologist, I'm interested in what's called the anthropic principle. Well, that says there are various fine-tunings in the physical universe, in the values of the constants, which seems to be necessary in order that life can arise, in order that the universe can become aware of itself. I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, it would take too long, but it was a subject I helped to found really with Martin Rees way back in 1979. And it was very controversial because, you know, people said, well, if there are these fine tunings of the constants, maybe this is God, and the physicists didn't like that, obviously. Nowadays, they think the explanation is the multiverse. I think actually, Ivy mentioned my book on the multiverse, Universe and Multiverse. So the multiverse says there are many universes where the constants are different, and this is how we can explain the fine tunings in our universe, because we have to be in one of the universes which has the right conditions for life. But anyway, the point is, my ambition and the ambition of other people is to somehow extend science from the domain of matter to the domain of mind and the domain of spirit. You see, most people, including scientists, will think that science is really concerned with the material world. But other people think that really we can extend science to discuss phenomena which are associated with mind, in particular consciousness. So the question is consciousness, in some sense, can can be explained physically in terms of physics. At the moment it can't, because we don't, obviously most people think the brain generates consciousness, but we don't understand how the brain generates consciousness. And as I said before, you have to extend science to accommodate mind if you believe in the phenomena of parapsychology. So you'll find that quite a lot of physicists are open to the idea that science, and in particular physics, can be extended to accommodate mind and consciousness. To say that it can be extended to accommodate spiritual phenomena is a more controversial step, and you'll find that most physicists are very opposed to that, primarily because they actually don't believe in the phenomena. I mean, most physicists don't believe in psychic phenomena. Most scientists don't believe in psychic phenomena. I do, but that's because they haven't had the experiences. And they're even more reluctant to talk about spiritual or mystical phenomena. I mean, it's not that they deny people have spiritual experiences. It's just that they would say that they're nothing to do with science. They're nothing to do with physics. So you've got the idea that science studies the material world. You can have your mystical experiences, but it's nothing to do with science. The problem with talking about mind and psychical phenomena, that makes people uncomfortable, because it's saying that science can be expanded to accommodate those phenomena, because the point of psychical research is that you're trying to describe your phenomena, the psychic phenomena, in terms of science and physics. And that's why it's so unpopular. Psychical research, the physicists don't like it because they don't believe in the phenomena, and even the mystics don't like it too much because it's too scientific. So anyway, that's just to give you the general overview of where I'm coming from. I want to be extending science, and in particular physics, in order to accommodate these mental and spiritual phenomena. But there is, there's a huge opposition to this, because most scientists are materialists, in the sense that they think that really matter is the only reality. They're also reductionists, in they think that everything in the world can really be explained in terms of local interactions between bits of matter. And also they're what might be called epiphenomenalists, which says that consciousness is generated by the brain. And this means that mind, in some sense, plays a purely passive role in the universe. I mean, we are conscious, but, basically the laws of physics go on regardless of whether anyone's watching it. And the final view of many of scientists is, of course, that of atheism, which says that essentially religion and spirituality and mysticism are basically illusions generated by the brain. Now, I have to say, I don't believe any of those four propositions. And in fact, nor is that really, are those statements, are those philosophies part of science. They are what is really part of what is sometimes called scientism. So remember, it was materialism, reductionism, epiphenomenalism, and atheism. That is the dogmas of what's called scientism. It's a sort of very extreme fundamentalist form of science. But I would argue, and many other people would argue, that you have to go beyond that. And you can actually, it's what's sometimes called a post-materialist science. There is even now, there's an academy for the advancement of post-materialist science, which says that science can be extended beyond the material world. And obviously, this depends on exactly what you mean by science, because that's a complicated issue. And I don't want to get into that. I'll only say that science, underlying science, is the idea that there are laws which describe interactions on all these different levels, be they material, mental, or spiritual. That those laws can be studied and in some sense even theorized about, maybe even mathematically. That's what I'm going to do in the second part of my talk. And so I see there's 6 minutes, so I'll just carry on with this general introduction. What I want to say is that the history of science the history of physics, if you like, has been the expansion of our awareness to ever larger and smaller scales. So, of course, as human beings, you know, primitive human beings were only aware of a relatively small range of scales, sort of, you know, tadpoles to mountains and things. But as we progressed through science, through astronomy, we become aware of ever larger scales of structure. So we've gone through our geocentric view. We used to think the Earth was the center of the universe. Then we went to the heliocentric view when we realized that the sun was the center. Then we went to the galactocentric view when we realized the galaxy was the center of the universe. And then we went to the cosmocentric view, which basically says we can see all of the universe, at least, from which light can have traveled since the Big Bang, which was 14 billion years ago. So this is, if you like, the outward journey of which has been given by physics. And then also we've looked on smaller scales using microscopes and then accelerators and all the paraphernalia of particle physics. And then again, we've discovered smaller scales of structure. So we start off discovering things like ants and amoebas, and then DNA, and then atoms, and then the nuclei in atoms. You're going to smaller and smaller scales, and now we speculate about the smallest particles in nature, you know, which we haven't even discovered yet, the sort of particles they're discovering or trying to discover in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. But the point is that physics has been amazingly successful in producing our understanding of all the scales of structure in the universe, from the scale of the smallest scale of quantum gravity, if you like, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, to the scale of the visible universe, which is something like 10 to the 27 centimeters. That's roughly 14 billion light years. And my favorite image is the Cosmic Uroboros. Am I able to share the screen, or will that be complicated? But the point is, the Cosmic Uroboros is that my favorite diagram. It's the snake which swallows its own tail, and at the tip of the tail is the smallest scale of quantum gravity, and where you might have M theory, for example, our final theory of physics. The head of the tail corresponds to the scale of the observable universe, and that relates to the idea of the multiverse. But the point about this Cosmic Uroboros, which is my favorite picture, but I'm not going to show it, represents the triumph of physics. But the trouble about this triumph of physics is that it's actually missing something, because this picture makes no reference to mind and consciousness. If you like, it's the triumph of mindlessness. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis now on mindfulness. But so, in my view, it's absurdly arrogant to say that physics is close to a theory of everything, because actually it's only a theory of physics, and it doesn't describe half of our experiences. I mean, half my experiences of the world are in the world of mind and in the world of spirit. None of that is described by this wonderful triumph of physics. So the question is, can we expand physics to accommodate those phenomena? Most physicists would say no, but in the second talk I'm going to say, yes, we can do it. It can be done. But I hope I've given you a sufficient motivation. There are lots of reasons for thinking that mind is fundamental to the universe, which I won't go into now because I'm running out of time. But maybe you could ask me about those in the question session. But the key point I want to make is you have to expand. Physics is triumphant, but only in a certain domain. We have to expand it to accommodate mind, consciousness, and spirit.
Would you agree with Bernardo Kastrup that the universe, and when you zoom it out to the larger scale, and our brain circuitry has an uncanny...
I can't hear everything you're saying, Ivy, but I heard your reference to Bernardo Kastrup. So can I perhaps answer your question? As I think you're suggesting. Okay. Bernardo Kastrup, I know Bernardo very well. In fact, I was one of his PhD examiners, and I feel rather close to him because our names are rather similar, Bernard and Bernardo. Bernardo, he is an idealist. You know, the philosophers tend to divide into three groups. There's the materialist, who thinks that basically matter is fundamental. There are the idealists who think that mind is fundamental. And then in between, there are the dualists who think that both mind and matter are fundamental, and in some sense, they're two sides of the same coin. And so philosophers tend to go into one of these headings. Now, the idealist basically is saying, well, everything is in the, you know, for a materialist, the problem is, how does mind arise? How does matter produce consciousness? In particular, how does the brain produce consciousness? And we don't know the answer to that because we know there are correlations between what goes on in your mind and what happens in the brain, but we don't know how the brain generates consciousness. But nevertheless, most materialists have this sort of this hope that eventually they will be able to explain how matter produces mind, because they regard matter as the fundamental reality. Remember, that was materialism was one of the features of scientism. On the other hand, if you're an idealist, you say mind is the fundamental issue. Mind is the fundamental property. After all, that is what we're most aware of. And the problem then becomes, well, if mind is fundamental, where does matter come from? Okay. So both of these points of view have problems. The first problem is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. This is David Chalmers' favourite phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. But if you're an idealist, there's the hard problem of matter. Where does matter come from? Now, as I said, Bernardo is on the idealist side. Now, my view, as I'm going to explain in my second mini talk, is that actually, really, mind is fundamental, and in some sense, the more fundamental, in the sense that mind comes first. So, in a way, I do agree with Bernardo. But there is still the issue of what does that mean about the physical world. I don't think the physical world is an illusion. Some idealists think that, well, the physical world is just an illusion, like a dream, and isn't really there. I'm not an idealist in that sense. I don't think the physical world is an illusion. I think the physical world, there is an external reality. It's just that I think that the mental world is also an external reality. But the point is that there are many different versions of idealism and many different versions of dualism and many different versions of materialism. So I'm being very simplistic. But by and large, I'm very sympathetic to Bernardo's view, even though most physicists probably wouldn't be. But the really fundamental question when you talk about consciousness is, does the brain generate consciousness, or is the brain merely a filter of consciousness? In other words, is consciousness something outside which is filtered through the brain, rather like a TV set? You know, you switch on the TV and you see all these images on the screen, but you know, ultimately the images aren't in the screen. There's an outside world. There's a scene which is being broadcast by the TV wave, the television, electromagnetic waves, and the TV aerial. And the idea is, some people would argue that the brain is like that. The brain doesn't generate consciousness. The brain merely is a channel of consciousness, so that the consciousness sees the world through your eyes and hears it through your ears. But the brain, in fact, is restricting your experience of the world. Because so long as you're perceiving, consciousness is experiencing the world through the brain, then you're only perceiving certain things. Now, most neuroscientists would take it for granted that the brain generates consciousness. But I think both myself and Bernardo would agree that actually, I mean, I don't know, but you know, it's a question of what model you favour. We both favour a model where consciousness is merely channeled through the brain. And so then you have to make a distinction between, if you like, there's some big consciousness with a big C, which is sort of universal, and then we have our individual consciousnesses with a little c. And so the idea is that in some sense, ultimately, we are all one. We all have individual eyes, if you like, and we all seem to be separate. You know, there are billions of us on the face of this planet. We all seem to be separate. If this filter model of consciousness is correct, there's ultimately only one eye. If you like, it's consciousness with a big C, or mind with a big M, and that's then getting filtered through all these little brains to produce consciousness with a little c, or mind with a little m. So I'm not sure, Ivy, if I've covered your question. I didn't quite hear all of your question, and I probably answered things you didn't ask, but is that helpful?
Professor, can you hear me loud and clear?
I can now, yes. You break up sometimes.
Yeah, sorry about that, because I'm speaking through Clubhouse, and then we are streaming the audio back to you, so
I
everybody
understand, yeah.
Yeah. The question is, Professor Carr, would you agree with Bernardo Kastrup that when we look at the universe in the largest scale, our brains actually look identical? It's like uncanny resemblance. You agree with that, Professor?
I think you're saying is that when you look at the largest scale of the universe, with all the, you know, all the cosmic structures and the filaments and the galaxies and the clusters of galaxies, and then you look at a picture of the brain, you know, and you magnify it and you see all the neurons, they look rather similar. I don't know if this is what you're referring to. So then people say, well, in that case, maybe the whole universe is actually a huge brain. Is this what you're referring to? Good, right. Well, now, you see, that's interesting, because what I've said is that there is a mind with a big M, which in some sense is going to incorporate the whole universe, and there's our minds with a little m. I mean, actually, it's more, in my view, it's more complicated than that. You have a hierarchy of levels of consciousness going from our individual consciousness to the cosmic consciousness. But if you're saying there is this dichotomy between the very large and the very small, you could say, well, that's in terms of our experience, in terms of our conscious, you know, our mental experience. What you could say is, well, maybe that also applies on the physical level. Maybe the physical structure of the universe is really just analogous to the structure of all the neurons. And that sounds a bit metaphorical and a bit dramatic, and I'm certainly not saying the whole universe is a giant brain, but it is true that when you look at the images, they look similar. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say that the universe is a huge brain, but I would like to say that there is a universal level of mind, and our individual mind is like a reflection of that. You know, it's like a microscopic reflection of the macroscopic. You know, that's quite a common idea. But it's, in any case, the images look the same. There's no doubt about that. But you have to bear in mind, Ivy, that, you know, when I talk about universal mind and universal consciousness and all this, this is not the view of mainstream science. Okay, it's the view of a minority of people, so it could be wrong. But if you take that view, well, maybe the universe is a giant brain in some sense, because there's no doubt that the universe, it's interacting on all these different levels. I mean, in the Cosmic Uroboros, which I didn't show, you've got all these different scales of structure, and they're all interacting with each other. Okay, there's all constant interaction between the micro domain and the macro domain, and it's full of interaction and transfer of information. So in some sense, I would say the universe, it's, you know, information is fundamental, and the universe is interacting with itself all the time. and on all different scales. I mean, obviously we're aware of it happening inside the brain, but it's happening on the planet Earth, you know, through the biosphere, you know, Gaia and all that, but constant interaction. But I think it's also happening on a larger scale. It's happening on the large scale of the solar system, maybe on the scale of the galaxy. There is a sort of galactic ecology where everything is interacting with each other on all these different scales, and finally on the scale of the cosmos itself. So this is all very speculative, but personally I like that idea. It may not be right, but it's fun to think about it. I do think there is a sort of, we're all very conscious of ecology, and we're all aware of the environmental problems on the planet Earth, you know, with global warming and how we have to respect, you know, the ecology of the planet Earth. But I think there's also an ecology on larger levels as well, the galactic level and even the cosmic level. I think we're all part, in some sense, of a living universe. So I think that's what Bernardo was saying, and I think that makes sense. Thank you for that question.
15 years after I joined an evangelical church, I was deep in meditation and prayer. You know, having lived this life as a child and as a teenager, I felt like I wasn't living up to the standards that religion and spirituality was demanding of me. So I went into a very, very hardcore prayer ritual and going to church every day, and you know, entered this very tough space in my mind. To the point where I lived in a realm of magic almost, right? It was demons, angels, God, and you know, also all the philosophy from Hinduism that was kind of bubbling up and trying to reconcile, and having had 3 relapses of psychosis, and finally deciding I'm not going to go off my meds. I'm going to keep chemically stable because I don't want to go into a dangerous space. I see that your view is kind of, you divide the world into 3 parts: the physical, the psychic, and then the spiritual.
Yeah.
And they're all real. How do you reconcile the idea that the brain has such a powerful modeling engine that we could be imagining all this, and what research do you have to share with us that kind of confirms the idea that the mind is not just making up all this, you know, finding patterns in nature and having just evolved spirituality rather than it being a fundamental thing that exists out there?
Okay, well, thank you, Alfonso. That is very interesting. And before answering that last question, can I comment on your earlier discussion, because I was fascinated with that, and in some sense, there's a parallel with my own, because you've obviously gone through a spiritual journey which has taken you through, you know, different paths, Hare Krishna, and then fundamentalist Christianity and other things. And I was rather similar, because I started off as a Christian. I then became interested in Buddhism. I then became interested in Kabbalah and Sufism. So I don't regard myself as restricted to a particular religion. I'm interested in spirituality in general, and I feel all these different paths are valid. They're all different routes up the mountain. And so I think it's actually, for many, I mean, for some people, it's important to try different spiritual paths. Now, then you referred to your own, some personal problems, psychosis and things, and I'm of course sorry to hear that, but that also raises an important point, because if you're involved on any spiritual path, you know, that is always a risk. I mean, obviously, if you start taking any path which gives you an altered state of consciousness, makes you aware of a different level of reality, is going to have dangers. So, you know, we all know about psychedelics. I mean, it may open you up genuinely to newer realms of reality, but it's dangerous. And meditation can be dangerous too. You need to have a teacher, because even meditation, you know, can lead to all sorts of dangerous encounters. And so I'm sorry you went through those experiences, but in some sense it's not unique. That is the danger of any spiritual path, I would say. Now, but then you raise the whole question of the role of the brain. And what I found interesting about your story was that actually, as soon as you took certain chemicals, the psychosis stopped. Okay, and there, of course, was clear evidence that the brain, the physical does affect your experience, your mental experience. So that itself is an important point, because most neuroscientists will infer that because something you do to the brain affects your experience, therefore your mind is generated by the brain. And I would argue that that is not a necessary inference. Clearly, when consciousness is connected to your brain, anything you experience is exhibited by something in the brain, and if you do something to the brain, then it affects your experience. So if someone sort of hits you on the head with a hammer, you fall unconscious. So clearly, the brain does affect your experience. But again, I would say that doesn't mean that consciousness is actually generating. That doesn't mean the brain is generating consciousness. It merely says that so long as consciousness is linked to your brain, the brain affects it. Now, that then leads on to your final comment, I think, which is, since the brain affects your mental experience, the state of the brain affects your mental experience, you're saying, could the whole of reality be actually a creation of the brain? Okay, I think that's your point. Could it, in other words, could physical reality be an illusion generated by the brain?
Yes.
But of course, the problem with that is that the brain itself is part of the physical reality. So you can't be, if you're saying the brain is generating this view, you can't say everything in the physical world is an illusion, because the brain, which is generating the illusion, is part of the physical world. So I wouldn't infer from that, that the brain, the whole physical world is an illusion. Of course, you come to that conclusion, ironically, from certain religious traditions. I mean, in the Hindu tradition, one takes the view that the physical world is a dream, is an illusion.
Maya.
Is Maya, yeah, exactly. So, but you're coming to that conclusion, though, from a spirit tradition. You're asking whether you come to that conclusion from the perspective of neuroscience. And but I think what is undoubtedly true is that we know that our perception of the physical world is very strongly affected by the brain, and indeed distorted by the brain. So we know from a philosophical perspective that we never actually have direct contact with the physical world. All we have experience of is a map, if you like, your map of the world, which you get through your various sensory systems. So I'm partly agreeing with you, because I'm saying that actually what we think is the physical world is not the external reality directly. It's that projection of the physical world which is generated by your brain, and that can generate all sorts of distortions. Our memory can be faulty. You can have higher order cognitive processes which distort the appearance of the physical world. You can have hallucinations which are generated by the brain. So I'm agreeing with you that certainly the appearance of the physical world is distorted by the brain, but I would argue that that doesn't mean the physical world doesn't exist. I would argue that there is an external reality, but the other thing I would argue is that the external reality doesn't only consist of the physical world. You see, most people would say that the physical world is real, but what's in your mind, your dreams, your hallucinations, if you take drugs, if you're having psychotic episodes, the images you're seeing, they might say, well, that isn't real. The physical world is real, but that isn't real. I would disagree with that. I would say the world in your mind is equally real as the world outside. Okay, so the world you experience in your dreams has a reality, the world you experience when you go on have a mystical experience and experience the totality of the universe, whatever, I would say that is also real. So what I would say is, I would say not that. I would not say that the physical world is real, the mental world is unreal, which is what most people would say. I wouldn't say, like some of the Eastern religions, that the physical world is unreal, but the mental world is real. I would say both worlds are real in some sense, although we only perceive them in a distorted way. And I'm going to come on to that in the second part of my talk. But so it's a fascinating question, and there's an entirely different level at which one could answer the question, which is the notion that the whole world, the physical universe itself, is a simulation, a computer simulation. Because, you know, the idea is that a computer can simulate the physical world and the interactions. You can have simulations with billions of particles. People do this in cosmology, and it looks just like the real world. And sometimes you can't tell whether it's the real world or a simulation of the real world or the real world within cosmology. And of course, we're used to this with virtual reality machines. How do you tell if it's a replication or the real world? And so some people and some philosophers have suggested that the physical universe itself is a simulation in a computer, that the laws of physics merely represent the laws of the software. But that's a whole issue, and that's another issue which I won't go into because it will be another hour, and Ivy will be running out of money. So, but the point is that I wasn't interpreting your question in that sense, but that's another sense in which one could interpret your question. So that's rather a long answer, but and you may not agree with it, but I said so much, you probably agree with something.
I mean, I am aware of the we had Donald Hoffman a few days ago.
Oh,
so
right,
he was explaining the whole user interface theory, and we had Bernardo Kastrup a few weeks ago as well. So we are familiar with all these ideas, and I don't want to take up too much time because we have a bit of a queue of people who want to ask questions as well.
It's great that you had Bernardo and Donald Hoffman. I know both those people. So really, I'm probably preaching to the converted.
Yeah, I don't know if I have converted to anything again yet, but I like I said, we're running these rooms because we're fascinated by all these different theories and ideas.
Alfonso, I don't want to convert anybody, and in this area, nothing is certain. I think one just has to explore every possibility. I mean, as I said, I have my own views, but they're not the views of 90% of my scientific colleagues, so I could be wrong. But you have to be open to all possibilities, and that's why it's fun to have these discussions. I'm fascinated that you had Hoffman and Kastrup.
Yes, thanks.
Yes, we did.
Girls.
And I'm honoured to be in their company.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm honoured that you're on.
Yeah, Ivy is a huge fan of yours, and
Ivy, that's nice. I've never met Ivy before, but it's I was very touched by some of the things you said in your email, Ivy.
And I've become a huge fan now. I would love to spend an afternoon having a cup of tea and having a conversation, but I'm in Bolivia in South America, so it's a little bit hard.
Are you in Bolivia?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, I never knew that. Well, that's what I was going to tell you about in my story, but I'll tell the story at the end.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, no, the point that since you asked me, I have to. When I was traveling in the Andes, I saw a little sign which said Bolivia. So I thought, great, I can go to Bolivia, cut off another country. So we followed the road. It was very high up. It said Bolivia. And so I thought I'd visited Bolivia. But it turned out that actually it was not Bolivia, the country. It was a little town called Bolivia before you get to Bolivia, the country. You probably know about it. So, but I only discovered when I got there that I hadn't been in Bolivia. It's rather like the difference between Bolivia with a big B and Bolivia with a little b, rather like consciousness with a big C and consciousness with a little c.
Yeah. definitely.
But you know about Bolivia outside Bolivia, presumably.
Well, I think there's even a Bolivia in the USA that I've heard of.
Oh, well, that's not the one I'm referring to. This is a Bolivia in, well, I guess Argentina.
I'm going to pass the mic to Ari.
Yeah.
So listening to this idea that there is some reality within mind and there is some reality in the physical world out there. So how can we be certain that there is a physical reality out there when mind itself is able to project sense of reality to ourselves through dreams, right? So when mind itself, or if we call it a consciousness as well, so it is the place where final judgment of reality is going to take place. How can we be sure that we are not living in a matrix? How can we determine that? Model of mind, spirit, and matter has any ontological relationship to establish that we are not living in the matrix, to make a sense that there is a fundamental physical reality out there in some sense, as you said.
Well, the question of whether we're living in a matrix, whether we're living in a simulation, I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, because the point is that, a lot of my cosmology friends, think this is crazy. I mean, saying we're all in a simulation, but it's very hard to exclude. And indeed, a friend of mine, Simon Dewan, he has a model which is all based on the fact that we are in a computer simulation. And I think it would be very hard to exclude the possibility that we're living in a simulation. But if we're living in a simulation, though, I mean, it does raise all sorts of questions. If it's a computer simulation, it raises all sorts of interesting questions like, well, who is the programmer? I suppose in some sense the programmer is God, but also you've got you can have a hierarchy of simulations, because if I'm a computer programmer, I create a simulation of a universe which has got people, and then the people themselves create computer programs. So you've got programs within programs within programs. So you very rapidly get into this confusing idea that you've got a hierarchy of simulations. And then you have to say, well, if we're all living in a hierarchy of simulations, is there an ultimate reality somewhere where there's the real person sitting in his office with his computer? Maybe that's God, who made the original. Is there an original physical reality? And so I don't know. I would only say that a lot of eminent philosophers take this idea very seriously. But that your more general question was about the nature of reality. I mean, if you ask, how do we know the physical world is real, for example, I would argue the physical world, what do you mean when you say something is real? You basically say that there is the different observers in the universe, they're all observing the universe from different points of view, but there's a conformity in our different perspectives. So you have a universe with objects and brains all perceiving the world from different points. You can predict how the brains should experience those objects, and there is an agreement, and it all fits together. So there's a consensus, and that's why we think there is a physical reality. So even though the brain may distort the appearance of the physical world, I would say one of the triumphs of physics is to show that there is an external reality, in the sense that we can all agree on what that external world is like. Now, what it would be controversial is the statement that the mental world is also part of a reality, because the normal view would be that my brain creates an so there's the outside world, and there's sound waves and light rays, and it's producing inside my brain a little mental world, which is like a map of the physical world. But the idea is that, and so you and Ivy and myself, we've got our little bubbles, which are reflections of the physical world, but they're not connected. But and this would imply, therefore, that when we have our dreams, they're just in our minds, they're little bubbles. When we have our hallucinations, they're just little bubbles, and maybe you can get rid of them by taking chemicals or whatever, or create them by taking chemicals. For me, what the importance of psychical research and telepathy and clairvoyance and mystical experience is that it shows that actually our minds are connected. Okay, so that the dreams in my mind and the dreams in Ivor's mind aren't just separate, they are actually connected. So when I said that our consciousnesses are all connected to this one big consciousness, that's also saying our minds are not disconnected, they're all part of one big mind. And that means that that big mind itself is also a form of reality. It's reality in the sense that there are many different observers, not physical observers, but many different people experiencing the world, but there is consistency in how they actually experience it. And so that's why I would say that both the physical world and the mental world are real in some sense. But you see, that's somewhat distinct from your question of whether everything is in a simulation, which was also, in fact, the same point that Alfonso was making, because it could still, in some sense, it could still be a simulation. I mean, when I say it's real, I mean it's real in the sense there is consistency for different observers. But that doesn't necessarily exclude it in some sense being a simulation in some giant computer. I mean, I'm completely agnostic about whether we live in a computer simulation. Because it's almost, you can't disprove it. It doesn't really appeal to me very much aesthetically because of the problem of the hierarchy of realities and things. But you know, I think there can be a hierarchy of dreams. So maybe it is hierarchical. Have you have this experience where you have a dream and then you wake up in another dream and then you wake up and you're a dream within a dream within a dream. So maybe the fact that you got this hierarchical embedding of simulations, maybe that corresponds to the fact you've got a hierarchy of realities. I don't know. So I can't answer these questions definitively, but it's a fascinating question. So thank you very much, Jerry, for the question.
We would be willing to pay tickets to one of your talks that would be probably worth more than the ticket, and having you on a one-to-one basis is a great honor. So
thank you very much anyway. So you can carry these questions are very interesting, and to some extent they're impinging on what I was going to do in the second part of my talk, so we can carry on. Some of the questions might be answered in the second part. Okay, so I'll then start my second part of the talk. So you remember where we got to in the first part was that we want to expand physics to accommodate mind and spirit. So the question is, to address that question, we've got to understand a bit more about physics. Now, what one has to realize is that there are physics is based on two pillars. I'm sure you've heard about this. In the microscopic domain, you've got quantum theory. And in the macroscopic domain, you've got relativity theory, or more precisely, general relativity. And those are the two fundamental theories which describe with tremendous success the microscopic and the macroscopic world. And they work amazingly well. I mean, you can test them to 1 in a billion places of decimals, and they seem to work. But the real puzzle is that quantum theory and relativity theory are not compatible. And I mean, I won't go into too much details as to why they're not compatible. They just are incompatible. For example, I think you've probably got some background in physics. Relativity theory is all based on the idea that an object is a world line in space-time, and it's a straight line, if you like, in space-time, and the angle of the line gives you the velocity. But in quantum theory, you have something called the uncertainty principle, which says you can't know the position and the speed of a particle simultaneously. But in order to have a world line in relativity, you have to know the position and the speed simultaneously. And so there's a fundamental discrepancy between quantum theory and relativity theory. And so the final theory of physics has to go beyond quantum theory and relativity theory. It actually, and that is what physicists want. It's sometimes called the quantum gravity, or whatever your theory is, M theory, whatever that final theory is, it's got to go beyond quantum theory and relativity theory. And so my claim is that when you've got this final theory, which in terms of this, I talked about the Cosmic Uroboros, so I never showed it, but it's this diagram with all the scales to structure, the snake swallowing its tail, and they swallows it at the Big Bang. The head of the snake, where it's swallowing its tail, that's where that final theory is. That's where microscopic and macroscopic domains meet. And so the question is, does that final theory have room for consciousness and mind? So the point is, it's at the top of the Cosmic Uroboros. That, in some sense, is where you have your final theory of physics. And so the question is, will the marriage of quantum theory and relativity theory, will that contain consciousness? Now, so right at the top where the snake meets the tail. So as you go around the Uroboros from the tail, you can think of this as a ruler, and for every or a clock, for every minute the scale increases by a factor of 10. So it's like a 60 decades of scale, from the very smallest to the very largest scale. And the snake swallows its own tail, because in some sense that corresponds to the Big Bang. That's when the very large meets the very small. I can explain that in more detail if you want. But you've got quantum theory on the left, relativity theory on the right, and the idea is where they meet at the top, that's our final theory of physics. And so the question is, will that final theory of physics make some reference to mind? And I'm going to argue that it will. And I'm not the only person who argues that. Someone like Roger Penrose also believes that consciousness will play a role in our final theory of quantum gravity. You see, what's interesting about quantum theory is that quantum theory is the one point in physics where the observer seems to play a role. I mean, there are many weird and strange features of quantum theory. I'm sure you heard about this. Particles are no longer just objects. They're described by waves, which are sort of probability distributions. And then when you toss a coin and it's heads or tails, until you look, it's a superposition of heads and tails. And so the idea is that when you look, consciousness in some sense collapses the wave function. And so a lot of people think that quantum theory is important because it shows for the first time that the observer plays a role in physics. And maybe even consciousness collapses the wave function. Not everyone believes that, but at least there's a hint from physics itself that consciousness may be important. However, it's important to appreciate that this can't be the full explanation. Sometimes people say quantum theory is going to explain consciousness and mind. I don't think that makes sense, because it's, first of all, we don't understand quantum theory anyway, so it's just saying we're replacing one mystery by another mystery. But the other point is that quantum theory may say consciousness is relevant to the universe, but it doesn't explain experience itself. Quantum theory is not going to have anything to say about seeing a ghost or having an out-of-body experience. So what I'm saying is our final theory of physics has to go beyond that. And it also has to go beyond relativity. And the reason it has to go beyond relativity is because in relativity theory, you have this concept of the block universe where past, present, and future coexist. You don't have anything corresponding to the passage of time. Okay? And that's one of the mysteries. Relativity theory itself cannot describe the passage of time. Because, you might think about brain as like the world line of a brain is like a wire. And you might think, intuitively, that passage of time is like a little bead going up the wire. So past becomes present, becomes future. Future becomes present, becomes past, etc. But that doesn't happen in relativity theory. In relativity theory, there is no consciousness. So you've got to go beyond relativity theory and quantum theory to describe consciousness. And my claim is that the same theory which is going to explain quantum theory and unify with relativity theory is also going to explain mind and consciousness. And as I keep saying, this is not what all physicists believe. It's the view which I personally am pushing. Well, so what is this theory? And so let me just, as you know, it's going to involve the concept of higher dimensions. So let me just explain that a bit. In the Newtonian view of physics, you know, which lasted from the 1700 odd till 2000, there basically reality consists of three-dimensional space. Okay, there are three dimensions. You can go up and down, backwards and forwards, left or right. But also you've got time. So you've got your clock, which is ticking away. And the idea is that space and time is the same for everybody. Okay, and that is the arena of physical reality in the Newtonian view. And I referred to this earlier. So when we say the world is real, what we mean is that we've got the objects out there, which are all obeying Newton's laws. We've got our brains with our sensors and things. We're observing the world in different ways from different places at different times. But the Newtonian description seems to provide a consistent view of reality. Okay, and that's why it was so successful in the astronomical domain, for example, for many hundreds of years. And so, up until the 19th century, people would say, up to the 19th century, people would say reality is three-dimensional. But then the trouble was that Einstein came along and he told us that's wrong. Einstein said that the world is four-dimensional. You've got three dimensions of space and you've got one dimension of time. And these four dimensions have to be merged together as part of space-time. And I've already referred to this. And so, and as I said, within space-time, objects, you think of three-dimensional objects, but they're just cross-sections of a four-dimensional world line or a world tube. And so now the point is that reality is actually four-dimensional because different observers moving with different speeds, they measure different time intervals and they measure different length scales depending on their speed. And therefore, reality is not three-dimensional, it's four-dimensional. And the point about relativity theory is the only way of consistently reconciling all our different views of the universe, physical universe, is to say reality is four-dimensional. So Newton's theory, it works as an approximation, but it's wrong. Reality is four-dimensional. And however, you can still describe our experiences in terms of objects. Well, you've got your objects are like world lines and they're communicating through light rays and all sorts of things. So you can still have a picture of our interaction to understand how we perceive the universe. It's just that our perception of the universe is a bit more complicated in four dimensions. You're sort of observing the world along a past light cone. And actually, I think this is very important. I hope this isn't getting too technical, but within Newton's picture, there is a sort of distinction between the object outside and the object in the world. The object inside your head. So, for example, if I look at a distant star, you think there's a star out there in the physical world. A light wave reaches your brain, it produces a little star in your head. So the normal view is there's a star in my head and there's a star out there. And that's why you get the whole dichotomy about what's the relationship between matter and mind and things like that. However, in a four-dimensional view, I would argue that perception is a four-dimensional process. that the star out there and your brain are just two ends of a four-dimensional chain. So perception itself is four-dimensional. And what this is saying is that your experience of the world, your phenomenal world, is actually simply the part of space-time to which you're connected by all these signals, this nexus of signals like light rays and sound waves and everything else. So to me, I hope that's not getting too technical. To me, people ask what's the relation between physical space and phenomenal space. Someone asked this question earlier. I would say that if you think in a four-dimensional way, that actually your mental space is in some sense space-time. It's a projection of it in an informational sense. So that this is a sort of concept of an extended mind, which says that your mind, in fact, is space-time. So to think there's a distinction between outer space and inner space is in some sense illusory in terms of this view. Now, if you accept that, you can ask, well, where are memories, for example? Now, most neuroscientists will say that the memories are in the brain. They're stored in the brain. So that, if I hit someone on the head, they lose their memory. But I would say that if you believe that the image if the experience is not in your brain, but is just this four-dimensional process, that means the memory isn't in your brain either. The memory is actually a memory of an event in space-time is literally reenacting, re-experiencing that space-time. In other words, it's saying your brain has a tag rather than a trace. Now, again, this is controversial, and any neuroscientist might not like this view, but I think this is the view you have to say. But now, so this is the four-dimensional reality. Now, sticking with physics, you might have thought that was the end of the story, but it wasn't, because in the 1920s, Kaluza and Klein, these are two physicists, they said, well, look, maybe we need a fifth dimension to describe the electromagnetic interactions, because Einstein had shown that the gravitational interaction was the curvature of space-time. So space-time, if you think of it as a piece of paper, that piece of paper is curved by matter. And so that's a geometrical interpretation of gravity. What Kaluza and Klein said, they said, look, maybe there's a fifth dimension, but it has to be wrapped up very, very small on what's called the Planck scale, which is at the top left of that Cosmic Uroboros. And so you don't see this extra dimension because it's too small. It's much less than the wavelength of light. But the idea was that you need this fifth dimension in order to explain electromagnetism, another physical phenomenon. Now, people sort of forgot about that idea because the ideas of quantum theory started arising at the same time and people got distracted. But in the 1980s, physicists started thinking about what's called superstrings theory. And in superstring theory, there are even more extra dimensions. In fact, you have 6 extra dimensions. They're all wrapped up very small, so you don't see them. So you have 10 dimensions in total. You've got 3 space, 1 time, and these extra dimensions which are wrapped up very small. Now, obviously, these theories are rather complicated mathematically. It's not easy to think in 10 dimensions, or even 4 dimensions. But nevertheless, this is respectable physics. And it really was simply an extension of the old idea of Kaluza-Klein. Well, the trouble was, and by the way, string theory superstring theory was invented by one of my colleagues at Queen Mary College, Michael Green. He went to Cambridge after that, but so I put the plug my own college there. But anyway, as it happened, there were quite a number of different superstring theories. And then in the 1990s, it was realized that all of these superstring theories are part of a bigger theory called M theory. And M theory was meant to be this final theory of physics. And that has 11 dimensions, so it has 1 extra dimension. Okay, so the history of physics, in fact, is the history of going from 3 dimensions, Newton, 4 dimensions, Einstein, 5 dimensions, Kaluza-Klein, 10 dimensions, superstring theory, and then 11 dimensions. Now, of course, this seems completely counterintuitive. All these extra dimensions which you can't see, it might sound absurd. It has no connection with common sense. And yet that is the picture which modern physics seems to suggest, that there are extra dimensions. In other words, the reality, if you like, reality meaning that which consistently unifies all our experience of the universe, has got extra dimensions which we never experience in our normal physical world, using our normal physical senses. In fact, this paradigm of physics is really a mental model. Okay, it's all mathematics. It's within the mind. So the irony is that the final theory of physics is all in the mind, even though it seems that it doesn't make any reference to mind. So there's a bit of a paradox there. But there's another version of this, a particular version of M theory, which I'll just mention briefly, that says, well, maybe our physical world is a four-dimensional slice of this higher-dimensional space called a brane, B-R-A-N-E, not the B-R-A-I-N, the B-R-A-N-E. And what they do is they extend one of these dimensions, so it's no longer compactified, but it's extended like the other dimensions. And then you can see our physical world as being a brane in this five-dimensional bulk, B-U-L-K. Now, I'm mentioning this because this is a picture which is coming from physics. It's called the Randall-Sundrum picture. Okay, so try and hold that in your mind if you can, that the physical world, the material world, is just a four-dimensional brane in a five-dimensional bulk. Okay, so that's physics. But now I want to try and link it up with mind. Because the point about mental experience is that it involves a space. And in fact, sometimes that space is almost indistinguishable from physical space. Well, we know, of course, that there's ordinary phenomenal space, which is the space corresponding to physical reality, which may be distorted, but it's clearly a space. Whether or not what we experience corresponds to an outside reality, it is in a space. There's no denying that. But now think about other things. Now think about dreams, for example. Well, dreams, I don't know about other people, but I have a lot of lucid dreams. I wake up in my dreams, and it's in a space. It's virtually indistinguishable from physical space. I mean, I know I'm dreaming, so I know it isn't physical space, but it looks just like space. And if you have an out-of-body experience, your consciousness seems to leave your physical body, and you seem to be wandering around in a space. It even looks like the physical world. It probably isn't the physical world itself, because there are distortions which don't quite fit. You know, you go through the ceiling and you find the chimney's the wrong shape, but nevertheless it's in a space. Let's take another phenomena. Let's take the phenomena of ghosts, for example, apparitions. Now, of course, there's a huge folklore tradition of ghosts. Most neuroscientists would say they're all hallucinations generated by the brain, because clearly the brain can generate hallucinations. But the trouble is, it's not as simple as that, because sometimes you have collective apparitions where more than one person see the ghost at the same time. Not everybody will see it, but more than one person sees it. Or, of course, the traditional ghost stories where the ghost reappears at different times. But the point is, the ghost appears to be in a space, and yet it doesn't seem to be a physical space, in the sense that it seems unlikely that you can physically detect it with a physical detector. There are some alleged photographs of ghosts, but I'm not sure they're genuine. But the point is, it involves a space. Let's take a near-death experience. I mean, I don't know. I've never had, fortunately, a near-death experience. I don't know if anyone here has. But the point is about a near-death experience. Again, it involves a space. I mean, you start off, you might have an OBE, but then you go through a tunnel, and then you meet the figure of light, and then you're in a spirit realm. But again, it's in a space. Or you have to cross a bridge, crossing over, symbolizing the path from life to death. But it's all space. And even some mystical experiences seem to involve spatial characteristics. Not all, some mystical experiences somehow seem to transcend space and time altogether, but and indeed all mystical experiences seem to involve a distortion of space and time. So sometimes people say they've transcended time, but they probably just mean that the nature of space and time have changed in some way. But so the point I'm making is that the key feature of all these mental experiences, and by mental I mean normal mental, as in phenomenal space, psychic mental, as a body experience or something, or a dream, or even spiritual mental, an OBE or a mystical experience, they all involve a space. So my starting point is that whatever our theory of mind is, it has to involve a space, and yet it is different from ordinary physical space. Now, so the purpose of this space, in some sense, is it reconciles all our different experiences of the world. So remember, when we were talking about the physical world, we were saying we've got all our different observers. Let's go back to the Newtonian picture. We've got all our different observers. They have their perceptions of the world, which is sort of like two-dimensional projections. But there is a three-dimensional space which reconciles all our experiences, okay? And then you go on to the four-dimensional analogy of that. So what I'm saying is that actually you can extend this to all types of mental experience. Because our mental experiences, they're more complicated than simple projections of two-dimensional projections because they involve all our experiences. But the idea is they can all be reconciled if there is this higher-dimensional structure, which I call it the universal structure, but it's a higher-dimensional reality structure. And that's why I'm calling it a higher-dimensional reality. And so then the question is, if you've got this higher dimensional reality, why not identify it, which is, in other words, different sorts of spaces, why not identify it with the higher dimensional space which is invoked by these physicists? Now, most of the physicists would not like that. Most of the M theorists, they're my friends, they would probably be rather appalled at this suggestion because, they're anxious to prove to their physics colleagues that this is genuine physics and not just mathematics, because some people say it's all maths and not real physics. So they don't really want people like me saying, oh, it can be useful for explaining mystical experiences. So it's not a popular idea, but nevertheless, it does seem to me it's a natural hypothesis. Because if our physical world is a slice of a higher dimensional space, what else is in the space? Well, the only things I'm aware of are my mental experiences, be they psychic or spiritual or whatever. And so it seems natural, therefore, for me to say this higher dimensional space is which is invoked by physics, that, if you like, is the arena of mental and spiritual experience. And in a nutshell, that is what the theory says. So when I refer to this higher dimensional reality, or this higher dimensional space, you see, is a sort of universal mind, because it's basically mind-like. And in that sense, it's idealistic in the sense that Bernardo Kastrup would use the term. But the physical world is still there. It's still part of the reality. So it's not saying the physical world isn't real. It's saying that it's just a lower dimensional cross section of the higher dimensional reality. So hopefully that throws light on the an earlier question. And the only other thing I will say, because I'm talking rather too long, but the other thing I would say is you can ask, what are these extra dimensions? And I'll just make one final point. And this is, I mentioned the fact that in relativity theory, there is no passage of time. Okay, because past, present, and future coexist. However, one way to describe the passage of time is to imagine that one of these extra dimensions is actually a higher level time, which corresponds to mental time. Okay, and if you remember, I talked about the brain picture where you have a brain in this higher dimensional space. And in brain cosmology, you have a model where the brain moves through the fifth dimension. And I will only say that I have a model for the passage of time, which is 5-dimensional, because ordinary 4-dimensional space cannot describe the passage of time, but this 5-dimensional model can, and the fifth dimension corresponds to, if you like, mental time as opposed to physical time. But again, that is not a conventional physical view. It's not the view of most cosmologists. It's just my hypothesis. And the final feature I will emphasize is that consciousness has to involve what we might call the specious present, which is the smallest time of consciousness of what you can be aware. And for the human being, that's something like 1/10 of a second. And let me just illustrate this with, I think you can see my finger. If a light goes round in a circle, you see it as motion in a circle. But if it goes round more than 10 times a second, you don't see it as motion, you see it as a continuous circle. And that's because your brain, the shortest resolution time is something like 1/10 of a second. Okay. And so the passage of time only makes sense with respect to a specious present. Now, we assume that the only form of consciousness in the universe is human beings, okay, with their brains. We assume that that's we're the only conscious beings in the universe with our specious presence of 1/10 of a second. I think that's extremely arrogant. I don't see why there shouldn't be experiences of consciousness on many different physical scales, but they would all have different they'd all have different time scales or different specious presence. So, for example, I don't see why a computer shouldn't have a specious presence of a nanosecond. Or I don't see why there shouldn't be some extraterrestrial civilization with a specious presence of 1,000,000 years. Now, the point is that none of these levels of consciousness could interact with each other, but they could all be there. And I have the view that probably there's a hierarchy of consciousnesses in the universe. So we've got human beings, maybe you've got planetary consciousness, maybe stellar consciousness, galactic consciousness, whatever. I think there can be a hierarchy of levels of consciousness associated with a hierarchy of specious presence. And in my theory, although no one else probably believes it, in my theory, the specious presence is associated with a closed extra dimension. So this hierarchy of extra dimensions correspond to a hierarchy of specious presence, which corresponds to a hierarchy of levels of consciousness. Well, that is incredibly speculative. I mean, everything I said is speculative. Probably only one or two people believe this theory, but maybe I've converted Ivy and Alfonso, I don't know. But anyway, the point is, regardless of whether the theory is right or wrong, I'm trying to give you an example of how you can expand physics to accommodate mental and spiritual experiences. Because the point is, this hierarchy of consciousnesses also correspond to a hierarchy of levels of reality. And so, in a nutshell, that's what my approach is. And I hope I haven't lost everybody with all these higher dimensions.
No, you haven't. You haven't.
Thank you, Ivy. I knew you could think in 11 dimensions.
Professor, we have 10 minutes more of your time.
Sorry, I thought
the relevant question is probably, are you available to stay for however long you...
Yeah, I can say, because,
I think public service question, because to me, this clarifies a lot of stuff when it comes to thinking of consciousness and beyond. The question would be, what's your idea of identity? Do we have identity beyond the physical body and brain? Does it project, or is that lost? I think I asked a similar question to Bernardo Kastrup, and he pretty much said that identity is not much. He calls it experience, but identity kind of gets lost when the body dies.
Alfonso, this is almost the most important question. In fact, this is the question with which I'm obsessed. Why am I me? In fact, I had a debate with Bernardo where the title was "Why am I Bernard instead of Bernardo?" Now, but this is a really crucial question, because what I was saying, if you remember, was that there's only one consciousness. You know, consciousness is unitary. There's one consciousness, the big C, but that it's filtered through all these different brains, these billions, 8 billion brains on the planet now, and heaven knows how many in the universe. So consciousness is sort of fragmented and filtered through all these brains. But the key question is, why am I associated with a particular brain? So, for example, let's imagine you and I, Alfonso, let's imagine that we were born at exactly the same time in the same maternity ward, okay? And when in beds next to each other, or in cots next to each other, we both become conscious. Your brain lights up, my brain lights up. The question is, why am I me and not Alfonso? You know, before I was discussing this with Bernardo, but where it was B and B, now it's A and B. Why am I B instead of A? Now, I would argue that question is actually unanswerable within a materialistic paradigm. You may remember that I talked about from the scientism perspective. It's axiomatic that the brain is actually the epiphenomenal view that the brain generates consciousness. If the brain generates consciousness, it's meaningless to ask, why am I me instead of Alfonso? Because it presupposes that there is some self which is distinct from the brain. So within a materialistic paradigm, it's meaningless to ask the question, why am I Bernard and not Alfonso? And yet it can't be meaningless, because obviously I am not you, so it can't be a meaningless question. So from my perspective, it doesn't make sense for the brain to generate consciousness. Now, I have to say, I've given this argument to lots of neuroscientists, lots of philosophers. None of them believe it, except for Bernardo. And to me, I cannot see what's wrong with this argument. However, then the question remains, why am I me instead of you? Now, what is clear is that just as that there are different levels of consciousness which may correspond to different specious presence and different levels of time, it's clear that you and I are only separate with respect to a certain specious present. With respect to a specious presence of a second, a tenth of a second, you and I are separate, okay? And we have our own passage of time. But with respect to a specious presence of 100 years, there is no distinction between you and me. Okay, because there is, if your specious present is 100 years, there is no shorter time scale to experience. So our separation, in some sense, is an illusion generated by the fact that we're viewing the world through a specious present. Once you look on a higher dimensional perspective, you realize that you and I, and indeed Ivy and everybody else, we're actually only one. We appear to be separated because we're in this lower dimensional projection. So to me, you have to go and remember these higher dimensions are to do with time. So the only way to explain why I am me is to say that my identity is to do with a different form of time, which is not the ordinary physical time. And in fact, I wrote a little article for Bernardo's website on this very topic. And it sounds bizarre, but I'll give you, I don't know, people will think I'm crazy, but the picture is this. Once you've got a higher time, the concept of going backwards in time with respect to the lower time makes sense. Okay, you can have what are called closed time-like loops within the ordinary physical space-time. Now, this actually sounds bizarre, but it's a perfectly respectable concept even within relativity, because you have wormholes in relativity, and this is what Kip Thorne wrote about. Remember, he got his Nobel Prize for gravitational wave detection. I mean, the whole point about rotating wormholes, you can go backwards in time. So the idea of time loops actually does make sense within ordinary relativity theory. Now, what I'm saying is this. If you think in a higher dimensional perspective, you could imagine that I'm me. Let's imagine I go back in time, not my physical body, but let's imagine that my mental body or something goes back in time. Well, you don't have the problem of killing your grandfather, because back in time I'm a different person. It's not the physical body. This time I'm actually I'm you. I'm Alfonso. And then let's imagine I go back in time again and I become Ivy. So you can imagine that by going to a higher time dimension, you can have a situation in which actually we are all one person with respect to one time, but all different identities with respect to the lower dimension. So, I mean, it sounds crazy, and none of my cosmology friends will take this seriously, but that's actually the only way I can conceive of an answer as to how you resolve the problem of identity. How does consciousness with a big C fragment into billions of consciousnesses with a little c? And this is just my model. And I've never even published it as a physics paper. I mean, I published it on Bernardo's website. But what I am convinced of is that you have to address the question, why am I me? The question of why is it now, the passage of time, is analogous to the question of why am I me, which is to do with space. And I'm convinced that the answer to that has to involve higher dimensions. My own theory may be wrong, I don't know, sometimes I think it's crazy, but you have to go beyond normal space and time. That I would bet my life on.
Like a localized Uroboros, perhaps.
Yeah.
where you've got things coming and going.
You're right, and of course this is the message you get, for example, from Buddhism, that anatta, that ultimately it's an illusion. And what I would say is, it depends on what you mean by an illusion. I mean, what I'm saying is that the difference between you and me is in a sense an illusion, because ultimately you and I are one, and Ivy are all one. That's a higher level, but nevertheless, it's a genuine illusion. Now, if there's a hierarchy of levels of consciousness, the higher you go, you realize that what was below was an illusion. But it is a hierarchy, and you're raising the question of what happens at the ultimate level. At the ultimate level, do you transcend space and time altogether? Is your specious presence essentially disappeared because it's infinite or zero? Is there a state in which consciousness, even with a big C, ceases to exist? And that's a fascinating question, because that is the message you get from, for example, from Buddhism, that the state of nirvana really transcends space and time altogether. So it could be that the picture I'm describing, which is of a hierarchy of times, is only taking you so far, and you get to this ultimate state where you realize that the whole thing in some sense is an illusion. I mean, that all these extra dimensions are an illusion. I mean, you might not believe in these dimensions, but it may be that all even these higher dimensions don't really exist. And oddly enough, the same result may come from mainstream physics, because when people talk about quantum gravity now, they talk about the possibility that ultimately space and time and even these extra dimensions are all emergent. So you could be right. I mean, I have to say, Alfonso, I don't have any of these experiences, so I can't talk from experience as to whether consciousness disappears or anything like that. But what you're saying is consistent with some of the ancient Eastern traditions. But all I can say is, even if ultimately it does disappear, as a physicist, I'm mainly interested in the lower levels where it does appear. So even if it's an illusion, it's a very interesting illusion, and that's what physicists get paid to investigate. Rather like all a simulation, Well, if it's a simulation, because saying it's a simulation is a bit like saying it's an illusion. Well, it's still very interesting.
Thank you, Professor Bernard, for spending your time with us today. Where is science at as regards to understanding dark energy and dark matter? That's it.
That's it. That's another hour's talk, but I'll try and compress it to a few minutes. First of all, one has to realize that we know from astronomical observations that, that visible matter is only a small fraction of the matter in the universe. I mean, roughly speaking, 5% of the universe is in the form of visible matter. Okay, and but what we do know is that something like 5 times that, in other words, something like 25% of the universe is in some dark form. We know that from studying galaxies. We know our individual galaxies surrounded by a dark halo. And we also know it from studying clusters of galaxies, because you get galaxies merge and they form a cluster, and their individual halos then form a collective halo. And we have very good evidence for that from studying the gravitational effects and gravitational lensing. And so something like 25% of this, so you've got 5% in visible matter, 25% is in dark matter. We don't know what the dark matter is. Now, some people think it's some form of elementary particle, which is predicted by some of these, theories of particle physics, called a WIMP, sometimes, weakly interactive massive particles. Some people think it might be something astrophysical. For example, in my professional work, I think it may be some small black holes which are made in the early universe. They're called primordial black holes, but we don't know. But we do know it's there. At least we're pretty certain the dark matter is there, even though we don't know what it is. And in a way, it shouldn't surprise us, because only a small fraction of things are visible. I mean, things are visible because they emit light or because they reflect light. So we shouldn't be surprised that some of the universe is dark. Now, the dark energy is different. The dark energy is actually, we know that the universe is expanding. That was discovered by Hubble. And you expect, though, the expansion of the universe will slow down because gravity will decelerate it, the gravitational influence of all the matter, the galaxies it contains. So about 20 years ago, people were very surprised to discover that the universe is accelerating. And the explanation of that is thought to be, in Einstein's original equations, you have another term called the cosmological constant, which corresponds to a repulsive effect. And originally, when Einstein had his theory of relativity, they didn't know there was anything outside the galaxy. He thought the universe was the galaxy, and he needed a repulsive term to balance gravity so you could have a static universe, because the galaxy is essentially static. But then later on it was realized that our galaxy is not there are many other galaxies, and the galaxies are all moving away from each other. So that was the discovery of the cosmic expansion. But the point is, what is causing the acceleration? It's this so-called cosmological constant, which was the term that Einstein introduced to explain how he could have a static galaxy. When they discovered the expansion of the universe, he realized he made a big mistake, and he said this introducing the cosmological constant was his biggest blunder. But actually, it turned out he was right all along. There is a cosmological constant. Now, what does it represent? In some sense, it represents the energy of the vacuum, of the background space in which all the galaxies reside. So it's the vacuum energy, but we don't really know what it is. In the simplest picture, it's a cosmological constant, but it could be some sort of field. We generically call it dark energy. And so the dark energy has something like 70% of the energy of the universe. So most of the universe, most of the energy is in dark energy. So 70% dark energy, 25% dark matter, 5% ordinary matter. And so that's a mystery just within the context of ordinary cosmology. It doesn't have any direct relationship, as I've described it at least, to things like matter and mind. But sometimes people do say, there's an analogy, because you've got the conscious and the unconscious in the Jungian, and so maybe the relationship between the conscious and the subconscious and the unconscious, maybe there's a parallel there between visible matter, dark energy, but it's just an analogy. But some people think it's more than an analogy. Some people think, well, maybe dark energy is, we don't, but the irony is we don't know what the dark matter is, and we don't know what the dark energy is. I mean, it's very frustrating. We don't know what most of the universe is. It's also a real mystery that they've all got roughly the same density. I mean, they're all, one is 5 times the other is 5 times that. So why should they be the same? It's a real mystery. But some people have said that perhaps the dark energy, which is some form of field, maybe that field is what you need, sometimes people think consciousness is associated with a field, okay? And maybe that field, the question is, what field is it? It doesn't seem to be a normal physical field like an electromagnetic field, but maybe there is some field in physics which will be related to consciousness, a sort of psi field, if you like, or something like that. And so some people might even speculate, well, maybe that's got something to do with the dark energy. So maybe consciousness is to do with this, but I think maybe that's going a bit too far. But again, you can't exclude it. And as I said, I tend to think in terms of higher dimensions, but again, that's not incompatible with this view that that you've got dark energy. I mean, you're asking really, is there a connection between dark matter, dark energy, and higher dimensions? Well, that will be another hour, but it's a very interesting question.
Thank you, Professor Bernard, and yeah, thanks. I just want to say I really appreciate you being here today. I was actually your work by Ives, and I've actually been a fan since then. And of all the distinguished guests that they've had so far, you've been my favorite. So I actually listened to all the sessions. So I'm very happy to ask the question that I've been prepared. And I think it speaks to what I think about your concepts that particularly resonated with me was the concept of higher dimensions. So, I mean, I think, a lot of the stigma in science has been associated with the experiences. So what I've loved is that you've been able to talk to the experiences. But I know as a scientist who's had experiences, there's that resolution of, justifying or, explaining these experiences to people who may not understand in a credible and possibly not just speculative but actually what's the word I'm looking for? Actually sound matter, right? So yeah. I guess how I'll wrap up the question is if you have to explain the concept of higher dimensions or this use whatever scientific methods to actually conceptualize it in a way that it can actually be tested as an experience and for other people, what would that look like? I hope that made sense.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and first of all, the point to make is that most of my scientific colleagues haven't had the experiences. I mean, they don't, as to say, they're mainly skeptical of psychic phenomena and spiritual phenomena. And that's because they haven't had the experiences. And I don't mind that at all. I mean, I don't mind if someone hasn't had the experience if they don't take it seriously. Because people don't have time to read all the literature. And in science, you have to be very focused on your own area of research. You can't even think about other areas of physics, let alone other people's weird experiences. So I don't mind at all when people are skeptical of these phenomena and why they say they're too busy to think about them. I only get annoyed when people haven't read the literature and haven't had experiences and says it can't be true. It has to be rubbish because it's not compatible with physics and all that. So the point is, the experience, it doesn't bother me too much that most of my scientific colleagues don't believe in they don't believe in, because they don't believe in the experiences, they're not very interested in the model to explain the experiences. But I accept I'm only talking to a small fraction of people. But the point is, though, that the key word you use yourself, Ron, was experience. I mean, you normally think of science as being the domain of experiment. It's the third person perspective where you're doing experiments in the traditional way. But now we're talking about experience, and a lot of people would say, a lot of scientists would say, well, experience is outside the domain of physics altogether. It's first person. But I don't take that view, because I am trying to expand physics to accommodate experience, and I've indicated how to do it using higher dimensions. Now you're saying, how would I persuade my skeptical scientific colleagues of these higher dimensions? Well, the interesting thing is, of course, that the higher dimensions have been advocated by the physicists themselves. That's what M theory is all about. Now, I have to say, it's not as though all physicists believe this. I mean, some of the biggest brains on the planet work on these ideas, on M theory and things like that. But some more down-to-earth physicists think, oh, it's just mathematics, it's not physics. So even within physics itself, there's a bit of a debate about what constitutes proper physics. But nevertheless, people are looking for these extra dimensions, and people have looked for them using the Large Hadron Collider. You know, that's the accelerator where you whiz up the particles, and when you get to high energies, you start creating particles. You know, we discovered the Higgs particle just about 5 years ago or something. Now, it was also thought that you might, in principle, be able to probe these extra dimensions by getting to higher and higher energies. Well, actually, it turned out that so far they've not found any evidence for these higher dimensions, these extra dimensions. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means they're too small to actually detect, because in some sense, the smaller the dimension, the more energy you need to get there. So the fact that we haven't found the extra dimension merely means we haven't got enough energy. But in principle, the energy, the extra dimensions could be there, and in principle, they might get detected one day. But the irony is that I would say that the evidence for higher dimensions actually comes from experience, you know, from some of the experiences I've talked about, because what I would say that some of the phenomena I've described, the ones that require a space, do require higher dimensions. And if you also believe all this idea about the specious presence being wrapped up dimensions, that also requires a hierarchy of extra dimensions. So I would say that at present, the evidence for the extra dimensions comes from experience rather than from experiment. But of course, most physicists won't believe it until it comes from the experiments. Now, when it does come from the experiments, that's going to be really weird, because let's say they accelerate these particles at CERN and they find the extra dimension. That's saying that this extra dimension has something to do with mind. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes I think it sounds crazy. But I don't know, did you see that film Interstellar? I
love it.
Yeah, well, Interstellar was based on a novel written by Kip Thorne, who did the work on wormholes. And the idea in Interstellar was that you go back in time, and there is this extra dimension, but that actually also had this concept that in some sense it was associated with mental experience. So, you know, maybe it's not, I'm not saying for a moment Kip Thorne would, who's a friend of mine, I'm not saying for a moment he would endorse my particular model of experience, of mental space. But nevertheless, although the concept seems crazy, it does at least appear in a well-known science fiction movie. So I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, in principle, the physicist isn't going to believe it till he's found this extra dimension in his accelerator experiments or something. But I would say that psychical research, studying apparitions and things, and even materializations or whatever you happen to believe in, I would say that there is evidence that comes from science, even if it's not a fully acknowledged science. But really, the main evidence comes from experience, as you said. I hope that helped.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Special thanks to Professor Carr. My question is with reference to the observer and what we call as the anthropic principle, or the observer selection effect.
Yes, of course. One
of my favorite topics. That as you go into other dimensions of and observers?
Well, this is interesting. The anthropic principle is one of my favorite topics, and I wrote about that way back in 1979 with Martin Rees. We wrote a paper which appeared in Nature, and it wasn't the first paper on the topic, but it was the first paper to get a lot of publicity, being in Nature. So I'm very fascinated in the anthropic principle. I think there are definitely coincidences to be explained. It was a very unpopular idea when we first suggested it. People thought it was too much like philosophy, or even too much like theology, because one suggestion was that God must have created the universe, and physicists didn't like that at all. However, then the idea of the multiverse came along, and the idea of the multiverse, in some sense, legitimized the idea of these anthropic tunings, because the idea is you have all these universes with different constants. We have to be in one of the universes where the constants are appropriate for life. Okay. Now, a lot of people don't like invoking lots of other universes, but nevertheless, that was a natural way in which you could explain the fine tunings. And my book was called Universe or Multiverse. That was 2007 or something like that. But what was fascinating was that a lot of people, a lot of eminent physicists, soon came to take this very seriously. And these were atheists. They weren't the physicists who were interested in God and things. They were people like Steven Weinberg, okay, who's a famous atheist. My own supervisor, Stephen Hawking, who was another atheist. People, well, I mean, Martin Rees. I mean, there are lots of eminent physicists who take the multiverse very seriously. It's still a provocative subject. Not everyone believes in it, but at least it's taken seriously. But what you've got to realize is that there are many different versions of the multiverse. And the many worlds arise in the Everett picture of quantum mechanics. You've got cyclic universes which expand and expand and collapse and bounce and expand and collapse, and each time they bounce, they change the constants. You have the inflationary scenario where you have all these bubbles. So there are many different types of multiverse. But I think you're asking, how does the multiverse relate to what I'm talking about? And that's quite interesting, because when I write about the multiverse, I publish that in conventional physics journals, so I don't talk about linking it with mind in any sense. But the anthropic principle links with mind, because you have to ask, well, what's being selected for? And you can certainly argue that what is being selected for is consciousness, is the observer. So there's certainly a link, I would say, between the anthropic principle and consciousness, the observer. So the question is there a relationship between the multiverse and consciousness? And I've two minds about this. There is one version of the multiverse, for example. You remember I talked about brain cosmology, where you've got the brain as a slice, BRANE as a slice in the higher dimensional bulk. Well, you can have a picture where you've got lots of brains all lined up in this fifth dimension. That's one of the versions of the multiverse. And then occasionally they collide and they make big bangs and things like that. But then if I'm using the fifth dimension to make mind as the space for mind, this is saying there is literally a link between the multiverse, that version of the multiverse, and mind. And actually, the very word multiverse was first used, I think, by William James. And he, of course, was into psychology. So, I mean, I think, at least in some particular version of the multiverse, I think there is a link, because that particular version uses higher dimensions, but not in all of them. I mean, if you've got the normal cyclic universe, I'm not quite sure how that relates. Well, except you could say that even it's interesting, because if the idea is the universe is going through cycles, and every now and then it starts off with the right value, so the cycle becomes conscious. The next cycle becomes conscious in some sense. But you could ask, well, is this bigger consciousness with a big C? Is this outside? Does big C contain all the cycles? Or is big C just associated with one cycle? So again, there are all sorts of fascinating. I mean, I can't answer the question, but they said God tried to create the world 7 times in the Kabbalah, and so before he finally succeeded. So there you've got the idea of consciousness with the big C. It's containing lots of these little cycles. So it's fascinating. I mean, I think there can be a connection. In my writings about the multiverse, I normally steer clear of these more speculative ideas about consciousness, but I think ultimately there must be a connection.
Yeah, I have a particular interest in verifying precognition, and I wonder how did you verify the precognition that you had was a legitimate external experience?
Well, I mean, I've had quite a number of apparent precognitions. Of course, any one of them you can ask, well, was it a coincidence? You know, the skeptic will say they don't believe in precognitions. I don't think I'll go through all my... It would take too long to go through them. But I did have a series of precognitions I quite enjoyable. In London, we have what's called the Metro, which is our daily newspaper. And I would have a series of strange dreams which would wake me up. And then they would correspond to what was in the Metro the next day. So, and again, I'm not going to go through them, it would take too long. But I would say I am very open to the existence of precognition, not just on the basis of my own experiences, but on the basis of other people's experiences. And the question is, how do you explain precognition? In the block universe of relativity, the future does exist. The past and the future coexist. And so in principle, you might think the future could be experienced, because that's what the block universe means. Now, in the model I'm talking about, the 5-dimensional model, remember the extra dimension corresponds to mental time. And what happens is that at any one point in mental time, you have different possible futures. But then as your consciousness interacts, you choose a possible future. You know, do you go left or right? And you choose it. And then the next moment you make another decision, do you go left or right? So you gradually, all these potential lines sort of get solidified out. So you have potential futures. And so then you have a version of precognition which says that the future isn't absolutely determined, but you have a certain probability. You have different possible futures. And so that's my own theoretical model. But the point is, with this model, higher dimensional model, because the higher dimensions relate to time, they do allow precognition. And furthermore, you remember the idea of the specious present is that within the specious present, there is no distinction between past and future. So for normally, our specious present is just a second tenth of a second, okay? So we can't distinguish between past and future. But you now imagine a situation where your specious present gets expanded for some reason, because it does, the specious present can change. Let's imagine our specious present got expanded so it was a day instead of a second. Then it would contain events in the future. So I think you can use this idea of these extra dimensions being specious presence to explain precognition. But of course, this is only if you believe in precognition, and most of my physics colleagues don't believe in the phenomenon, and therefore they won't be interested in the explanation. But for those of us who do believe in precognition, you have to have an explanation. And this, I think, is the explanation that makes most sense, invoking some higher order of time. 11 o'clock for me, so that's...
Yeah, are you getting tired?
Because Ivy's getting tired. She's probably going bankrupt by now.
No, I haven't.
In fact, if we finished at exactly 11 seconds past 11 minutes past 11, that would be a nice synchronicity. All the ones, all the eyes. 1 1 1 1 1 1.
Would you come back again if we invite you?
Okay, yeah, that would be nice. Thank you so much. It's been fun talking to you all. And now, Ivy, you must eat because you're visibly shrinking before my eyes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye, everybody.